Good morning, Jeremy.
Now, this morning we're looking at the changing sort of CBD of Warrnambool, are we? Or
Yes,
how things have shifted?
a lot of work done on complete revamp of Liebig Street, and it's looking beautiful, and it's caused a lot of people to think about Liebig Street, and we're getting a lot of debate in the press about parking and about bringing people into the back end of the city.
Yeah. Although, just to distract you for a moment, and this is not entirely unrelated, but I can't remember why, but I was just playing around on Google Maps the other day, going up and down Liebig Street for some reason. I don't know if you've done this, but it's an interesting mix because there are photos there from now, and then you'll sort of go forward one step, and suddenly you get a photo from 2008. I don't know why that happens, but for some reason, some of the frames are still really old. So you'll suddenly get the street full of trees, and then you'll get it sort of empty if you go back a spot. It's quite fascinating.
Yeah,
for a sort of instant comparison.
I'll try that. But yeah, I'm interested in it because really. It's an interesting concept, a main street. You know, if you go into American cities, Warrnambool's a planned city, and you can tell that by the grid. Pickering drew up the grid in 1846, and then and certain areas were reserved for things like church use that didn't happen until years later. But he didn't. He just named the streets, and he gave them pretty interesting names. But he didn't call one Main Street. If you go into an American city. Often American cities have a street, and it's the main street, and it's called Main Street.
Or even a high street, I suppose, is often the main street, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. And that didn't happen in Warrnambool, and consequently, Warrnambool Street's main area has moved over the years.
Right.
So it's interesting to have a look at the moves, and there are always reasons for these moves. There are pull factors that cause this to happen. So. So the first main street in Warrnambool was Banyan Street, or Merri Street and Banyan Street, and that's because it was closest to the port area and to where people eventually made landfall by the time they got off the bullock dray that had come up from the port, and and so Merri Street was the thoroughfare from the Hopkins River punt to the port via later on the tramway that went down to the port. And so Banyan Street, coming off that and heading off that first block of Banyan Street, was where the first businesses were, and it was a very mixed bag of businesses. We had a flour mill at each end of that first block, and we had the National School on the corner, on the first, the Timor Street corner, which was also acted as the first churches, so that the denominations took it in turn to use the National School on Sundays.
Right.
And we had bakeries, and we had a couple of hotels and various other commercial businesses along that street. And also Bateman's produce store, which was certainly the biggest business in town in the 1850s. And it's Bateman's store fire, when it burnt down, taking another couple of businesses with it, I think, in 1856, that causes the first move. So after Bateman's fire, there's a big hole in the middle of the street. And so that's when the business...
So the solution was, well, we'll just move the main street somewhere else.
Yeah, well, we'll just move around the corner into Timor Street.
Right,
And that's what they did. So Timor Street after Bateman's fire, so from about 1860, right for the next 20 years or so, was really where all the focus of commercial activity was. And if you're chasing any businesses or through advertisements in the papers, all businesses were opposite the post office in Timor Street.
Right.
They didn't have street numbers in those days. They just said opposite the post office. And when you consider that the same size that the post office was, the south side of Timor Street, was all reserved. There was a market on the corner where the Lighthouse Theatre was now. Then there was the post office, and then the next block was reserved for government. So it was really only that north side, and everything was there.
Jammed into that.
Yes. So if you were a businessman, there was a little bit of from about the late 1860s and early 1870s, it spread round the corner into the bottom end of Liebig Street as well. So So that was the focus, and it wasn't until the 1890s that changed when Fairy Street becomes an important street as well. So things start to diversify and spread out. Fairy Street and Kepler Street had their own special purposes and flavours. Even though Kepler Street was the financial district, the Wall Street of Warrnambool. Don't laugh. Because there was on the Timor Street corner there were banks on
which are still there. Some of those buildings, aren't they?
The buildings are still there. The Gallery nightclub was a bank, and the building opposite it. And then the AMP insurance company on the south corner, and a hotel on the other corner.
And there's still a tiny bit of that AMP sign sticking out, I think, isn't there, from behind the new TAFE building,
Yeah, and then further up the street you had insurance and other produce stores. So it was, and some of these places lent money as well, or had customers who had credit with them, so it was the financial district. But then Fairy Street, from the late 1880s, becomes important because the railway came through, and so it's the thoroughfare from one end of town to the other, because the other end you had Raglan Parade developing when land on the north side of what's now the highway starts to be opened up for housing and development. So those cluster of 19th century shops you still see in Fairy Street. Some of them still have the dates of the buildings on them, and they're late 1880s, most of them. So, and
some of the businesses are still there as well, aren't they?
Yes.
Above the top parts of the buildings.
Yes. And they were retail shops that had people in those days lived above the shop, so they were 2-storey Victorian buildings with the shop front with the large windows down the bottom, and then the family living above, and quite ornate fronts too. So then gradually, it was probably in the 20th century, with the arrival of people like Younger's store, Coles and Woolworths in those other blocks further up in Liebig Street, that Liebig Street became the centre of the retail business of the town.
And Fletcher Jones, would that have been important, or would that have come much later?
Yes, he started in the northernmost block in Liebig Street, and then moved down further onto the corner, where he had his factory up the top floor, and retail on the bottom floor.
Yeah, right. Yeah, okay. And so that's because there's been talk, hasn't there, in more recent times about like the revival of Fairy Street, I think, and so on.
Yes.
I guess it still shifts, doesn't it? I mean, Liebig Street's still very much the focus, obviously.
But the focus is now in Liebig Street on some of the big chain stores. So that's got to do with worldwide changes, really. It's happening all over the place. If you go into any provincial city in Australia, you will find probably the same stores in the main street.
I suppose once a town gets beyond a certain size as well, and given that Warrnambool, as you say, was planned initially, and that plan is sort of fine when it is a smaller town, but once there's the need for more retail, more business, etc., that is going to be very muddied, isn't it? Just where that focus is in the middle, it's just going to become that whole central part, instead of saying, well, this is just the one street that's our main street as such.
Yes. Yeah. And supermarkets, when we had one supermarket with one car park and everyone feeding into it, that was happening at Coles supermarket in Lava Street.
Yes.
Now, they're being more strategically placed on the outskirts, and attracting their own little cluster of other shops around them.
Indeed. Excellent. Janet, thanks again very much. We'll catch up with you next week.
Okay.